My great-grandparents immigrated to the United States in the 1870s. They homesteaded in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 1880s. My dad eventually inherited the homestead, and he purchased a cabin not far away in the 1950s. We spent a lot of time at that cabin. I eventually inherited that cabin, and I own it today. It is my Catholic cabin.
So when I was a boy, we lived in Chicago, and we'd come up here on vacation, and I couldn't get enough fishing. So I wanted to fish every day, every hour of every day while we were out. But my dad had work to do at the cabin here, so um, there were times that I couldn't go. But when we did catch fish, we put it in our live box here next to the dock. And one time my dad saw me going into the box with the worm trying to catch the fish, and he yelled at me and told me never to do that. Made me promise I wouldn't try to catch the fish out of the live box. Well, I was bored and I wasn't catching anything one day, and he was busy up in the cabin, so I snuck the cage open and I put the night crawler in the cage and I caught one of the fish. So I went running up to the cabin to show my dad, and I was going to tell him I caught it out of the live box, but he looked at it and he said, "Wow, that's a nice one. Where'd you catch it?" And then I remembered I wasn't supposed to be catching it out of the live box, so I told him I caught it off the dock. And then I caught another one, and I caught another one. And my dad said, "Well, they must be biting. Let's go fishing." Well, then I realized this is a great way to get my dad to go fishing when I wanted him to. So I did this several times, and eventually he did catch me. And so he was very disappointed in me, and I received the consequences that I needed at that point. And I felt terrible because I broke a promise to my dad. My dad did forgive me. So, and it's just the same way. We make a covenant with God when we're baptized and we have faith in Him, and but we will break it at times. We do break our promise, and we have a very loving, forgiving Father in heaven who forgives us those times when we do sin. So, just as my father forgave me and didn't kick me out of the family, God doesn't do that to us. We're out here at my great-grandparents' homestead. This is the apple orchard from probably put in about 1884 or thereabouts. That's when they first moved out here. And so this is, behind me, is the one of the original trees. It's a Wolf River apple. And as you can see, it's grown quite tall here, but it's also very old, and you can see this branch goes out. It's still live, and it still has apples on this side. This branch over here also went out this way and bears apples as well. It's just not a good year for apples this year, so there's not much on it. So we're out here today talking about the beginning, how God created and the relationship that God created us in relation to Him, plus what happened and why we're sinful, why we have fallen. So anyway, if you remember Genesis chapter 1, God created everything from nothing. God created everything good. He created, and it was good. In fact, He spoke. He used nothing to create with. He simply said, "Let this be," and it was. And He saw that it was good. Then God created the earth. He created animals and plants. He created everything that exists, and then He created us in His image. He said, "Let us create them in our image." So God created mankind in His image. In the image of God, He created them, Male and female, he created them. Scripture records that we're created in the image and likeness of God. That's the end of chapter 1. In chapter 2, Scripture takes a slightly different approach. Instead of talking in a grand sweeping way, it starts to talk about Scripture in a more personal, relational way. So God creates the first man, I should say, out of the clay of the ground and fashions him in, as a potter would fashion a pot. And then he takes the man into the garden, and he shows him what the garden has in it, and then he shows him the tree. He says to the man, "You are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. From that tree you shall not eat. When you eat from it, you shall die." What is God saying? What kind of a tree is it? Art has expressed this typically as an apple tree, like what's behind me. And so we kind of have this concept of this fruit like an apple, as the one that Adam and Eve ate. But that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what is this fruit? Well, let's look at this in a more symbolic way. And we need to think about what knowledge is for a second. There's knowledge, which is knowing something, right? I mean, I could read a book and have knowledge of something. I could read a book about, let's say, a jet airplane. And I read this book inside and out. I have this memorized. I have this down to the last detail. I get the flight manual. I read it. I study it. I get flight simulators on my computer, and I fly virtual planes on my computer. So if I then invited you to take a flight with me on the actual airplane that I've never flown before, except I have all this knowledge from the book and knowledge from playing a simulator, would you want to take a flight with me? I don't think so. I know I wouldn't want to, if somebody invited me under those circumstances, to take a flight, because I have knowledge, but I don't know. I haven't experienced it. Another way of looking at that is, let's say I made a beautiful looking pie, this gorgeous pie, and I offered you a piece of this pie, and you sit and you have the first bite of this beautiful looking pie, and you gag. Why? Because I put mistakenly salt in the pie instead of sugar. It would be terrible. So we experience, or we gain knowledge by eating from the fruit. That's what happened. It was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, Adam and Eve were created good. They experienced evil by committing sin. And from that point, God said they were surely doomed to die. All right. So a little later in chapter 2, God creates Eve, and they're together. It's like this beautiful love story. They're in this beautiful garden, just the two of them, and the next scene comes on. Now imagine you're watching a movie and you see and it's this beautiful love story, and there's the man and the woman in this beautiful garden, and all of a sudden you see a snake slither through the grass or up a tree. How would we react? Well, our reaction is snake. Snakes are usually poisonous or something, right? We are. It's a symbol of danger. It's a symbol of evil. Imagine, using the movie analogy, if there's a cowboy who is out on the range and he's got his campfire going, and he gets in his blankets and he's going to go to sleep, and you see a rattlesnake slip underneath his blanket.
We wouldn't go, oh, how cute. The rattlesnake is going to cuddle with the cowboy and stay warm. No, we know it's danger. We know there's a problem. And it's the same thing with this. The serpent appears in the garden. The serpent begins to tempt Eve. He begins to say to Eve, eat this fruit. It's great for gaining knowledge. You'll be like God. You're going to be just like God. God's holding out on you. He doesn't want you to be like him. And so she eats. Now, we also have this misconception that Adam was somewhere out in the garden, not, doing whatever he needed to do, doing his cutting wood or whatever. Okay, and here comes Eve with lunch, and she tricks him into eating the fruit. If you look in the scripture, it says Eve turns and gives some to her husband who was with her. The serpent was there speaking to both of them, but only talking to Eve. Adam was right there, and he eats from the fruit. And now we have what's called original sin. This perfect union that God made with man and woman in the beginning has now been interrupted by this grievous sin. Whatever it is, eating that fruit was committing sin of some sort. So now what happens? Well, the man and woman realize they're naked. They put fig leaves together and they try hiding from God. God comes in the garden and says, "Where are you?" Now imagine yourself. Put yourself back, let's say, 6th grade, and you have a family heirloom in the house. And this family heirloom is priceless to your family. And your parents told you, if you ever break that thing, you are going to die. All right, and you take that quite seriously. Well, let's say you're in your house and your friend's over, and being a boy, I'm thinking like boys would play. Parents aren't home. Hey, here's your new football. Let's try it out. And you start throwing it back and forth, and boom, the heirloom is down and busted. Well, the first thing that would happen is your friend would take off. And leave you there alone to deal with your parents. So now you hear your parents driving into the driveway in your home, and you start freaking out. What do? Well, many kids would just hide, right? Typical reaction. Your parents would come in, and you're busted. All right, now you think you're going to die. Well, that's what's happening here. So God finally, he talks to Adam and Eve. They can't hide because it's God, right? And so God says to them, "What have you done?" And so Adam, he blames the woman. The woman blames the serpent. And the serpent really, I guess, has nothing to say. Scripture says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike at your head, while you strike at his heel." So Scripture is saying that this woman, he's going to place enmity between the woman and the serpent, between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent. This is called the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. This is the first promise or the first good news, but this is right at the very beginning. So let's look at what would happen in my analogy. Okay, your parents come home and they find the heirloom busted and you expect to die. That's what's going on here. But guess what? God is saying you're not going to die now. You're going to have offspring. This is good news in and of itself. Secondly, that there will be a woman who will have enmity who will never be on the serpent's side. There will be enmity. They will be enemies. And that the seed of the woman will eventually crush the head of the serpent. This is the good news. This is the promise, the first good news, the promise of redemption.